Good evening. I'm Mike Donato, Hempfield School Board President, and I want to thank everyone for virtually attending this meeting to explain enrollment projections, potential options, and the impact regarding our buildings and attendance areas. The information Mr. Berminski is about to present was presented to the Hempfield School Board of Directors during the March 10th School Board meeting. I want to emphasize that we, the Hempfield School Board and administration, are in the initial stages of gathering information from our enrollment and feasibility studies. The school board and administration are far from ready to make any decisions based on these studies. Part of gathering the information is to provide information to the residents of Hempfield School District. So you may ask questions and provide input to the school board and administration, which I highly encourage. Again, thank you for attending this meeting. And now I will turn the meeting over to Mr. Mike Berminski, Hempfield School District Superintendent. Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Donato, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. For those who are back with us for a second night in a row, we greatly appreciate that. Before we begin, I do just want to kind of set the stage. The purpose for tonight's meeting, as Mr. Donato shared, is to talk about the enrollment and feasibility studies that have been ongoing throughout the district for the last year and a half. We want to bring this information out to you through this virtual opportunity. We are recording this session and we will post it online. But we did present this to the school board in March, but we wanted another opportunity for families to hear the information as well. So here this evening, I'm going to go down as I see them on the screen. We have Mr. Mike Graham, who's our Chief Information Officer, Ms. Dee Galen, our Director of Special Education, Mrs. Maria Hoover, one of our Assistant Superintendents, Mr. Mark Brooks, our Chief Financial and Operations Officer, Mrs. Shannon Zimmerman, our Director of Communications, Mrs. Cheryl Purcell, our Director of Finance, and Dr. Tab Musser, another Assistant Superintendent. So they are going to probably take their video off at this time as we're going to continue through the presentation, but they'll come back at the end for Q&A. But I do just want to highlight a Zoom feature here that we do have live for you, for members who are in attendance. If you look on your screen, you will see Q&A. That's an opportunity for anyone in the public to pose a question or questions that you'd like us to answer. As we go through the presentation this evening, our hope is that we are certainly able to cover a lot of information for you, but don't feel like you can't ask a question. If there's time at the end, we will certainly go through some questions, and Mrs. Zimmerman will moderate those questions and will provide answers right here on the spot. And if we run out of time through this evening, then we will take those questions and begin turning them into an FAQ for everyone and continue to post that information. So again, on your screen, you'll see a Q&A. Simply click that and you can type in your questions. So we've been ongoing with this study for about a year and a half, and we've put all the information, whether it's been presented to the school board or through 2-minute talks, on our district's website. So how will you access, or how can you access that information? If you go to our main district website, www.hempfieldsd.org, and you click on School Board, a menu will pop up. And if you click down at the bottom where it says Enrollment and Attendance Area Realignment, it will take you to this screen. On this screen, you'll find lots of information from an overview to definitions, as well as the consultants that we've been using. But here on the left-hand side is where you'll find information regarding the timeline, all presentations that have been provided, whether it's been to building and grounds committees or our school board meetings, any additional updates, and then again, the virtual meeting information. That's where you'll find information moving forward here on this page. So again, just go to School Board, Enrollment Attendance Area Realignment. It'll take you to this page and where you'll have access to all the information. Just to do a quick recap, in the fall of 2018, we went back to the school board because there were concerns from the community, from our board, with regards to the changes that were being recommended at that time from an attendance area standpoint. And in the fall of 2018, we presented the school board with 3 options. And you see those options here on the screen. Ultimately, after discussion, the school board opted for the administration and the board to go with option 3, where the administration would work with a third-party, objective company to develop recommendations. And what they were looking for are short and long-term strategic ideas with regards to enrollment and facilities, with a goal for implementation in the 2020-2021 school year. So a process began to, an RFP went out for us to find architects as well as demographers. We did public interviews at a building and grounds committee meeting, and ultimately Crabtree, Rohrbaugh & Associates was selected to conduct the feasibility study. At the same time, Decision Insight was selected to do the enrollment and attendance area work. And so you see that information here on the screen and the individuals that we've been working with since we've undertaken this project. Specifically with Decision Insight, what they were working on is looking at enrollment projections for us, for looking at a 10-year span. They're also doing attendance area recommendations, providing suggestions for us, as well as looking at residential development. And we'll get into that a little bit further, but they do that on a yearly basis where they're able to connect with East and West Hempfield, looking at Mountfield Borough, East Petersburg Borough, to make sure that we have the most up-to-date information on different types of zoning that will be occurring in the Hempfield School District. As we set out with the study, several goals were established. You see them here on the screen. One of the things that we really wanted to spend time focusing on was not only addressing the short and long-term impact of the increasing projected enrollment, but really to find a way to balance the enrollment across our elementary buildings. As you know, we have several elementary buildings that have the exact same layout and footprint. But as you look at the enrollments of those buildings, you see an inequity in terms of the enrollment based on size. So one of our goals here is then to ensure equitable space across the elementary buildings. While we're doing all this, we also need to look at transportation and, most importantly, minimize any type of realignment moves when possible. Every year, the Pennsylvania Department of Education requires us to submit our enrollment numbers, and so we refer to them as our October 1 numbers. And so you see our October 1, 2019 numbers listed below. Those are the numbers that ultimately become kind of the formal numbers in the system, though we do see ebb and flow throughout the course of the year, and we do monitor those on a monthly basis. When you look at our attendance areas, this is a map that focuses on K-6 attendance areas with regards to population density. So the darker blue color, meaning the higher amount of, or the larger amount of students that live in those areas. So you see the lines in red are the current attendance boundaries, and then you see the little icon of where the schools are. So as we've gone through this process, obviously we cannot move the schools. However, the attendance boundaries are something that we can take a look at to make sure that we are working to ensure that we have equitable enrollment across the district in our buildings to ensure equitable space and then educational programmings and to ensure that they're not impacted. As we've worked with Decision Insight, they provided us now with 2 years worth of enrollment projections. So these are the most current enrollment projections. Decision Insight provides 2 types of projections. They do a conservative approach and a moderate approach. So the conservative approach here is the line in black, and the moderate approach is in red. And you see, spanning out 10 years, while there's definitely a gap in terms of the conservative versus the moderate, when we've asked Decision Insight when they were here in front of our school board, we asked them in terms of what's their goal as they look at this. And their goal from a projection standpoint is to land somewhere in between those 2 lines. Working with demographers, they'll tell you, there's no exact science because there's certainly a lot of impacts when it comes to enrollment. But based on the statistical work that they're doing, looking at live births, looking at our enrollment history, looking at the dwellings that are scheduled to come into play in the Hempfield School District, as well as some additional information, they're able to generate these projections for us. So here on the right-hand side where it says, why is there expected growth? Well, what we're finding at this point is within the next 10 years, there's expected to be over 1,700 new dwellings in the Hempfield School District. That certainly will have an impact when they build houses, families and students come. And so as we are looking at the projections, underneath here, you see the K-12 highest enrollment projections. This is based on the moderate projections looking 10 years out, and this will be the highest projection at some point that we could possibly see in our schools. And then we've also added on this slide, based on the highest enrollment projections, and looking at the capacities of our building, you see down at the bottom of this chart when our buildings will reach capacity. The capacity number was developed by Crabtree-Rohrbaugh as part of the feasibility study. And so you see that based on the enrollment projections, we have several school buildings, Mountville, Landisville Primary Center, Hempfield High School, Landisville Intermediate Center, and Farmdale Elementary, that over time will either reach or exceed capacity based on the enrollment projections. Now we've been asked, well, looking at these projections, what did the projections look like in year one? So here were the projections in year one, following the same model of conservative and moderate projections. The first year are the green and the gold lines, the green being the moderate, the gold being the conservative. And then you see what happens then in the second year with the red and black lines. Interesting to note, on October 1st, when we did our enrollment projection, or looking at our PDE numbers, or what we call our October 1 numbers, we were actually spot on with the 7,025 students. That was in the morning. By the end of the day, that number had increased. That number still ebbs and flows as we finalize those numbers with the Department of Ed. But when we look at where we are landing at this point, we are within the conservative and moderate approach. So you can see what this trajectory looks like as we're going out 10 years. So when we look at the dwellings that are coming into the Hempfield School District, over 1,700 of them, you might say, well, where are they going to come? So here's a map that explains and really shows where those developments and the projected number of dwellings in each of the areas. And so this is definitely spread across our attendance area. And as we look at this, we're starting to try and pinpoint then at what time are these developments projected to be completed so that we can begin thinking about the impact with regards to our enrollment. On this slide, you see kind of two areas or two hot buttons, the red and the green. The red is basically within the first 5 years of the 10-year projection. And you see that it's a little bit scattered each year, where we have the highest percentage coming in potentially in the Mountville area with the Sedgwick development with 172 homes. We still have the impact in the Landisville area a little bit each year, anywhere from down to 8 up to 50 homes year to year. And there's still, there's a little bit of building in the Farmdale area. There is building in the East Petersburg area as well, but that's definitely scattered throughout the 10 years. As we look out in years 5 through 10 or 6 through 10, what we see from a concern standpoint here in green is in the year 2027, if everything still stays in line with regards to the current projections of when these developments will be completed, what you see are some pretty high numbers of dwellings that'll be coming in. And then if you look at the attendance areas, that will have a major impact on Farmdale and Landisville. At the same time, what we're also looking at is all the additional growth that we're expecting, and that's what you saw on a few slides ago with regards to the projections. So as we're looking to plan, we definitely need to be mindful and be aware and starting to think about what it could look like for us within our schools based on the current configurations. So at the same time that we were working with Decision Insight, working with Crabtree-Rohrbaugh on the feasibility study, we developed these guiding principles, shared them with our school board, and these guiding principles are what our goal is to come back to these as we're looking at any type of recommendations for any of the work that needs to be done with regards to our buildings and possibly any work that needs to be completed as a result of increasing enrollment. So you see, first and foremost, looking at the health and safety of all students, staff, and our community, making sure that our buildings have adequate space, making sure that they're up to code, making sure that they have the proper safety features to ensure a safe educational environment. At the same time, we also have to be very mindful from a financial standpoint in ensuring that the health or the financial health of the Hempfield School District is financially stable. As we're working through educational programming and looking at our space, we want to ensure equity across the buildings for our students, wanting to make sure that we're not having to negatively impact educational programming in one building and then not do similar things in another, causing an inequity for students with regards to programming. And we want to look at that not only today, but also out into the future, given the growth projections. When we look at things aligning to our comprehensive plan, as we look at our educational programming, that certainly needs to be a priority. But we also need to make sure that what we're doing within our buildings gives us flexibility of space, not only now, but in the future. So these guiding principles, while they could change at any given point, We are trying to stick with these guiding principles as best as we can as we're making decisions moving forward with regards to anything that will occur with our buildings. Part of the feasibility study also looked at the conditions of our buildings. And so on this chart, Crabtree Rohrbaugh Associates embedded not only the enrollment projections and looking at the capacity and utilization, but they also looked at the architectural site conditions and the MEP, or the mechanical and systems components of our building. And you see here a scale at the top of this sheet here. We've got a light blue moving into a lighter green, a little bit of a yellowish color, orange, and then into a reddish color. And so as we're looking at this, the lower the percentage or lower the number, as we're looking through any of this, certainly the better. As we start to work up through the progression here and the conditions of our facilities, when we start to see, based on the engineers that came through and looking at not only the sites, but the systems within our building, they work to identify specific areas within all of our buildings that they believe we need to get additional information on and begin developing a plan to ensure that our buildings not only are being maintained and we're providing the necessary services to those systems, but from a site standpoint, that we are ensuring that the work is continuing to make sure that meeting code, as well as making sure we're adhering to the space based on the enrollment of our students. So what you see here with regards to the numbers, we have several buildings where the numbers are at a 4. So those buildings are ones that we need to take a more serious, closer look at, while at the same time making sure that we're maintaining our other buildings. And so this is kind of one of those strategic parts that we need to be looking at and developing a plan and bringing that to the school board in terms of what will this look like over the next several years, recognizing that we have several buildings, Centerville Elementary, Landisville Primary Center, Landisville Middle School, and the high school, that we need to look at not only the site based on enrollment and the condition of the site, but also the systems within those sites. And then we have relatively newer buildings that we need to plan to ensure, again, that we are maintaining those over the years. So as we've worked through this, when looking at the enrollment projections, looking at our sites, we have come up with 4 broad options, and within each of those options, there may be sub-options. And I want to reiterate what Mr. Donato said earlier, that at no time at this point has the board made any decisions. As an administration, we have not made any recommendations to our school board. These are simply conceptual ideas. We will continue to refine and work through these ideas, but we wanted to bring them to you as a community so that the conversation can begin. And as Mr. Donato asked, that if you have ideas or you have suggestions or questions, please reach out to us so that we can engage in the dialogue and continue to refine and bring a solid plan to our school board members for them to consider moving forward. So this evening, I'm going to go through each of these options. And again, if you have access through the computer, use the Q&A tool if you have questions. We're going to start with option 1 and work all the way through option 4. But again, I just want to reiterate one more time, and I'll say it several more times through the presentation. These are just conceptual ideas, and no decisions at this point have been made, and no recommendations have been made. So we'll begin here with option 1. Option 1 looks at, from a K-8 standpoint, from an enrollment projection, is taking the enrollment projections and maintaining our existing facilities with no new construction, no additions, not doing anything to our buildings, but the question was, can we house the given enrollment that we're expected to see within our current buildings and maintain a quality educational programming for our students? So we have the moderate projections and the conservative projections. And then below, based on the projections, you'll see the impact based on the enrollment to the capacity. Anything that's showing up in yellow starts to become more of a warning, something for us to be mindful of. Anything showing up in red is 95% or 96% or higher, getting close to either meeting or exceeding the capacity of the building. So in this option, based on enrollment projections from Decision Insight, if we do nothing, do no attendance area realignment, what we will see is anywhere potentially for 4 to 6 of our elementary buildings that will reach or exceed capacity. At that time, we will need to begin taking away other classrooms, other extra spaces to provide additional classrooms for our students, which will negatively impact our program. But again, this option over here on the far right, you'll see that no students are displaced based on their current buildings and based on the current attendance areas. So as we look at this option of doing nothing, keeping our buildings as is, keeping our attendance areas as is, some of the impacts of these, I'm not going to go through and read all of them because they are here on the screen, but some of the impacts is that the students stay in their current buildings. Anytime we talk about attendance area realignment, we do realize that the emotional toll that that takes. We realize that families develop great relationships within the school community. They themselves may have attended the school. Their kids have had prior experiences, and they want the same types of opportunities for our students. So we don't take this lightly. But it is something that we have to look at as we're moving forward with regards to enrollment options. So we are trying to be very thoughtful and deliberate as we're working through this to make sure that any of our recommendations coming to the school board have been well thought out and well planned to move forward. When we look at the impact of keeping the existing attendance areas and not doing anything, we will see potentially a wide range of students in a given elementary building. So one question that would need to be discussed is, what size really do we want to see from our elementary buildings? And here we potentially have a range of 460 to 932 students in a building. Again, those are the moderate projections, but that would basically be looking at Rohrerstown and Mountville, built identically. And when we see the projections, one possibly being at 460 at a given point, and the same building a couple miles away, 932 students. So that definitely would raise some questions, and we would need some further discussion. As we looked at this, with the increasing enrollment at Mountville, the building is not designed to have 932 students in that building. So we would need to do something to be able to add on to the buildings. However, it would be a challenge to add on enough space to accommodate all of those students in a given building. And while we could add on, and you'll see that as another option, when you add on, you also have to take into account spaces such as the cafeteria, the health room, art, music, phys ed, the office space, the supplementary resources and supports that are provided to our students. All of those individuals, staff members, and services need space within the building. And then at the same time, you also have to look at the systems, the engineering, mechanical engineering systems within the building, and they have to be large enough to be able to handle the volume and space in the building. Doing this would also have staffing and transportation implications. When we look at option 2, this option, we're looking at possibly reconfiguring attendance areas and maintaining the current grade alignment. And by doing that, we would need to add on to elementary buildings, because we do know that if we even reconfigure attendance areas, we are still going to need additional rooms. And so what you see on this screen here is where we could possibly add on to the elementary buildings. And you see the number of classrooms that would need to be added, even with reconfiguring attendance areas. Still on this option involves a potential renovation of Landisville Middle School, and then questions regarding the high school based on enrollment and the facility condition. And we'll tackle the high school and some of the conversations that have initially started there at the end of the presentation. So as you look at this option, where we would need to reconfigure attendance areas, maintain the current grade configuration in our elementary buildings, so that would be K to 6 at all the buildings, and at Landisville Primary, K3, Landisville Intermediate, 4 to 6. What we see then on this first option here under the possibility of reconfiguring attendance areas is based on the enrollment projections. We do have students that would need to be displaced. You see approximately how many students and where they would move from, and then where they would move to. And this also would have an impact at our middle school based on the current configuration of attendance areas for that, where our elementaries actually feed into the middle school. And with all of these moves of students, that is also included into these projections. You see then down at the bottom of the screen, the impact based on the capacity of the buildings. Again, anything in yellow is more signaling a warning, starting to be mindful of reaching things we have to be looking at. But when we see the red, that again, reaching or exceeding capacity. And here we still have 4 to 5 buildings based on the potential conservative or moderate projections that would reach or exceed capacity. So when you see that, knowing that potentially students were displaced, I think a natural question that would be asked is, well then, would this be a valuable option? Certainly something that needs to be considered, but as we look at the number of students that would need to be moved, and we're still seeing red, we asked Decision Insight to go back to the drawing board and find another option possibly within this. particular option of reconfiguring attendance areas. So they came back with another option. And in this option, as you will see, even more students are moved. And so when we go back to one of the guiding principles of trying to minimize the moves, this is certainly going to be counterproductive to that guiding principle. But what we're finding here is we have less red, but there are still areas, potentially 2 to 4 schools, that will either be very close, reaching or exceeding capacity. But looking out in the future, we have some buildings that are in yellow that we just need to be mindful and continue to monitor. At the same time, when we look at this from a K to 6 standpoint, we do have students at the middle level that would need to be moved based on, again, the feeder patterns. And then you see the information in terms of the impact here. One of the things that I do want to draw your attention to here at the middle school is when you look at the capacity at the middle school is calculated differently from the architectural firm than it is at the elementary. At the middle school, they're actually looking at just rooms available, and they're not looking at from a programming standpoint. So based on current rooms available, you see what the capacity would be. If we look at how we're currently utilizing the middle school program with regards to the educational side of things, we would need to adjust the educational programming that occurs at the middle school from this capacity standpoint. So that would need to be another conversation that would need to occur from an impact to the educational programming. So these are 2 options within possibly reconfiguring attendance areas and maintaining the current grade alignment. So we started off with moving a good amount of students and then needing to move even more, but yet it still does not appear, based on the numbers, that this would potentially solve the issue, but we would need to further explore what are the impacts of this particular option. So as we look at the potential impacts of option 2, we have a large number of students that would be displaced. We have 4 to 5 schools, elementary schools, that would reach or exceed capacity. We still need to engage in that conversation about how big do we want our elementary buildings to be. And then we would also need to potentially look at adding on additions at several buildings. And by doing that, you are potentially going to impact the educational programming, not only during the construction phase, but needing to then have conversations at the elementary and the middle school about what would that programming look like. And again, from an option standpoint, we would need to identify the staffing and transportation implications. Continuing to look at this particular option, not only do we need to address the enrollment side, but we also have to address the renovations that were suggested based on the work that needs to be done at Centerville Elementary and Landisville LPC. So that certainly could be done around the same time as you're looking at potential additions. But a majority of the elementary schools would require additions, which again is a disruption to the elementary school instruction. We would need to certainly explore construction costs. And again, looking at the ancillary supports that are provided within a school system to ensure that they can handle the volume of students. As we look at the prototype buildings, we have 5 of them built basically with the same footprint. We also have to look at the systems, and we may have to adjust and add on to the systems within based on the increases to potentially adding on additions. So these are just some potential impacts of the options. And then we push for another option. What would it look like then if we potentially looked at, maybe we need to realign our grade configuration at our schools? Do we look at moving 6th grade students to our middle schools? So not wanting to rule any options out, and looking at the enrollment projections, we would still need to add on to Mountville based on the enrollment projections. Looking at the current footprint, again, and again, these are just conceptual ideas. It's a starting point. The work that would need to be done at Centerville Middle School and Landisville Middle School, just based on the current footprint. We would need to go through the PlanCon work, looking at educational programming. So what you see here may not even end up as a potential option, but it's something we wanted to be able to kind of start beginning to wrap our head around. This option would still require renovation at Centerville Elementary and LPC, and then again, we need to have conversations about the high school. So as we dug into this option to see what is that going to do with regards to our elementary enrollment, we have a couple options here within this bigger option. So in this particular possibility of moving our 6th graders to the middle school, there would still need to be some elementary students moved out into different attendance areas. But you see here on the far right that it is a smaller number of students compared to option 2. And when you see the impact of the moves based on the enrollment projections and looking at the capacity, you see then what potentially occurs. And here at Mountville in red, that's why the potential of an addition would be needed. While LIC is still showing up in red, we believe that there could be some potential additional work from an attendance area standpoint. But then from a capacity standpoint, we see an impact at Centerville Middle School, which again would require the addition as we looked from a programming standpoint. So then we tried to figure out another possibility, again, moving, while it's a similar number of students, but it would be shifting where the students would be moved from to. So in this particular piece, instead of moving all the students potentially to Rohrstown, we look at possibly Centerville Elementary. And again, we're exploring options and just wanted to see what if as we work through this. And then you see what happens. They're still very similar with regards to what we're finding at LIC and Mountville, and then again, needing to address Centerville Middle School. But you see that if we, looking at this, we're still in the green down at the very bottom here with regards to Centerville Elementary, if these projections were to come into play and were from an accuracy standpoint. So within option 3, again, we had two different options there, but then we started to examine, well, what would the impact of those options be? Clearly, we would need to look at the programming for 6th grade students and have conversations about what that would look like. Some initial conversations, and again, not to say that that's where it would end up, but there was some thought that maybe we would need to look at a transition opportunity for our 6th grade students and trying to create kind of a standalone program for them if that would be possible. What we're finding, just based on the initial footprint of the buildings, that needs some additional work. So the visuals that you saw, while it could lend itself in some ways to a standalone program, it may not be possible. So again, additional work would be needed there. We would still have some students who are displaced, and additional work would need to be done at Landisville Middle School. But here particularly, we would need to look at a staffing impact, not only at the elementaries and special areas and support services, but most importantly at the middle school, again, connecting back to the educational programming. And then, of course, looking at from a transportation standpoint, what would that be? At the same time, we also need to be mindful of the buildings with regards to some of the work that needs to be done, like Landisville Middle School, possible additional work from a renovation standpoint, which could be done at the same time as an addition. During a construction, while students are in the building, careful planning would need to be in place to ensure that we're minimizing the disruptions to the educational day. And we would need to look at, based on the size of the buildings, whether the ancillary support areas would be sufficient with regards to square footage in order to support the number of students. At the same time, we'd also have to have conversation like we talked about in the earlier options with regards to Mountville Elementary being around 800 to 900 students. Do we want to see a middle school at about 1,300 students? That's a potential based on a moderate projection for Centerville Middle School. That's certainly a lot of students in one building. So is there the proper space and the proper programming? So those are pieces that we've initially begun to explore from an impact standpoint, recognizing, again, that a lot more will come into play. So then we looked at another option. Well, what would it look like if we built another elementary building to address the enrollment area, or the enrollment projections, and to try and minimize, when best possible, the attendance area reconfiguration. Under this option, we would still need to look at some possible renovation work at Centerville Elementary School, Landisville Primary Center, and Landisville Middle School, and then again, additional conversations regarding the high school. Now, as we dig into these next options, we have several options within this option. Again, just trying to think about all the what-if possibilities. So one of the thoughts as we were working through this, based on when we see the number of students and when we look at the dwellings that are going to be proposed and in place being built, the thought being, well, what if we added a 3rd elementary school here at the Landisville campus? We currently have Landisville Primary Center, Landisville Intermediate. We could have conversations about, do we stick with primary center and intermediate and then another elementary? Do we look at 3 K-6 buildings? Again, these are all just possibilities and conceptual ideas. But exploring this option, we would need to, from a feasibility standpoint, really determine if the campus can support another school and with regards to the traffic flow. And so as we looked at this, we would definitely need to adjust attendance boundaries. And what you see on this screen is an adjustment of those attendance boundaries. And again, just want to clarify, no decisions, just conceptual ideas. As we looked at this option with regards to a new school in Landisville, just based on initial draft numbers, and then we know that more work would need to be done, but what you see based on the moderate and the conservative projection, with the number of students that would be on the Landisville campus from an elementary standpoint, K to 6, we find then what we see is the impact on the capacity. And looking out, one would say, wow, this may look pretty good for us from a standpoint of capacity. The question that we would need to dig further into, and you do not see it here, because again, this was just a very conceptual idea, would be the number of students that would be impacted. And so what we'd be looking at, and again, additional work would need to be done on the attendance boundaries, working with Decision Insight to ensure that we have all students accounted for and the impact of this potential idea. We would need to make sure that we had proper land and square footage around the campus and determine where the best spot would be for a new building. Recognizing we would still need potential renovations at other buildings. We may have some situations here. If I went back to the map, you'll see that based on an initial attendance boundary, that you may have students closer to another school, such as Mountville or Centerville, but need to be bused to the Landisville campus. I had already shared this in regards to whether the campus can handle the traffic. Again, when you talk about a new building, we would need to explore staffing impact, transportation impact, as well as the balance then of what would it look like for our middle schools in terms of the feeder patterns and the capacity impact, as well as the educational programming. And with this particular piece, when we look at on the campus, needing to determine where potentially could impact the fields that we have. So what would we do if fields were displaced? So one option, again, was on the Landisville campus. Another option, potentially, would be to look for something in the Silver Spring area with regards to land and potentially build a school in that area. And what impact would that have if that was a viable option for us to explore? You see here that attendance boundaries would be redrawn. And again, the impact of that, we would see just based on initial draft numbers, we have some additional work that would need to be explored with regards to Centerville, East Pete, Farmdale, possibly that new school with regards to the capacity. That's if the moderate projections come to fruition. If you look at the conservative side here on the right-hand side, you see a different picture. And so as we're looking at this as a potential impact, again, we need to spend more time working with Decision Insight on the attendance boundaries and what that would look like. Land acquisition would definitely come into play. Needing to make sure that we have a plan for the other buildings with regards to any additional work. Again, we'd be potentially in the same situation where students may live closer to one building but need to be bused. Again, we can't change the location of our current schools, but the attendance boundaries would need to be looked at. And again, because of it being a new building, we would need to look at things from staffing and transportation and the middle school impact. Another option that we then considered, well, we have success at Landisville with regards to the primary center and intermediate center. And we know that looking out, there's a potential for higher number of buildings or dwellings in the Farmdale area. Do we look at something like a Farmdale primary center and a Farmdale intermediate center? And what could that do from an attendance area standpoint and the impact? And so the impact there, you see attendance boundaries here are redrawn, but we would need to refine and get accurate numbers of students. And what you see then, is something similar with regards to Centerville and East Pete. We would need to look at those attendance boundaries. We need to be mindful of Mountville. Again, there's projected for high growth there over the next several years. That's under the moderate projections. But if we look at over here on the right-hand side under the conservative, you see a different picture. So at the top here, you see we would break out K to 3 and 4 to 6 at Farmdale. Again, another idea. And so what would those impacts be? Very similar to what we talked about in option 4A or 4B. We do, in this particular one, as well as the previous one, looking at Route 30 as a potential natural dividing line. But again, that causes a potential question of students living closer to one school than the other. And so those would be conversations if this would be a viable option as we move forward, as well as determining not only the number of displaced students that would need to be moved, but again, when you have a new building, looking at staffing and transportation and all the impacts from a middle school standpoint. We have another option here. Do we, again, because of success at Landisville Primary, Landisville Intermediate, do we look at doing something similar at Mountville? Since there is a high projection or probability for growth, do we look at Mountville Intermediate Center and a Mountville Primary Center in that capacity? And by doing that, again, attendance boundaries would need to shift, but it also provides us with another potential viable option. And so you see then the impact based on the moderate and conservative projections. We would still need to do some additional work, refining some attendance boundaries when you look at the numbers. But overall, again, it's something for us to consider as we look at this. We see less red, lots of yellow and green. And again, under the conservative piece, you see a different story compared to the moderate. So if we go back to our guiding principles, when we look at these options, trying to think about not only the health and safety of our students, minimizing moves for students, but also looking at the availability of space, not only today, but in the future, that certainly needs to come under consideration with any of these options. And so as we look at the impact of these options, what you're going to find, again, additional or very similar to options 4A, B, and C, the work that would need to be done, land acquisition, redrawing, really focusing on the attendance areas to identify students, number of students who potentially would be impacted by needing to move, staffing, transportation. We would need to change potentially the feeder pattern for the middle school for this particular possible model. And for example, does East Peak go to Landisville Middle School instead of Centerville Middle School? Those would all be things we'd have to continue to explore. And another potential option, impact of this option is, it keeps the entire Mountville community together based on the projected enrollment growth. So as we look at this, we also need to think about, for all of our options, any type of additional work with our buildings, looking at our prototype design. There is some potential in the future for PlanCon reimbursement, but that would certainly have to be explored given that we've built very similar buildings, if this is something that we wanted to recommend and for the board to consider. We would definitely be able with these options to keep elementary schools under that potential 900 capacity. Again, that's all based on enrollment projections and everything coming to fruition. And really trying to make sure that we can consolidate the design and construction schedule for anything that we do to really minimize the impact from an educational programming standpoint. And again, looking at from a financial standpoint. So all of those factors need to be in play as we move forward. So again, I know that was a lot of information, but as we look at these options, just conceptual ideas, we have 4 broad options at this point, not to say that there won't be more, but at this point we wanted to share these with you. And with under each of those options, we do see the potential for, for example, there were 2 options in option 2, and another 2 options in option 3, 4 options under option 4. So there's definitely a broader lens for us to be looking at with regards to the possibilities and asking that question, what if, as we move forward. Coming back to the overall facility condition, we do need to come back to the high school. That was something that I said we would kind of talk about as we get further along in the presentation here. And so as we look at the high school with regards to the potential of the enrollment impact moving forward, as well as the architectural and site condition and all the systems within the building, we have really 2 parts to that building, a part that was back in the 90s, a part back earlier than that. And so work needs to be done as we look at that building. But the question is what really should be done and how much at this point. So again, another conceptual set of ideas. Nothing is set in stone, no decisions at this point. But just from conversations as we're talking about it here, when you look from a high school standpoint, based on enrollment, if we see the increased potential for the high school, we would have some potential challenges to accommodate all the potential new students. So option 1 here has an addition that would be added potentially to address the enrollment. Option 2 would address the enrollment, and when it says here light renovation, that would be just selective work that would be done with regards to the systems and some of the site work that needs to be done in the building. Option 3 is, again, just conceptual idea to not only do an addition to address the enrollment, but also more of a comprehensive renovation to look at the condition of the building, looking at the work that needs to be done. And option 4 would be, is it something we need to look at from a new high school somewhere on the campus? Again, I know that's a lot of information there with regards to the high school, but again, they're just conceptual ideas. Nothing is set in stone. And as you see here, more analysis on the high school options would certainly need to be completed. But that was just, as I shared here on the screen, just very initial conversations. But we do know that work needs to be done within our buildings, not only from a maintenance standpoint, an ongoing maintenance standpoint, but also to address the enrollment potential growth that we're seeing that's slated for us within the next 10 years. So while that was a lot of information, we've outlined kind of some next steps. And unfortunately, with what's occurring with regards to the current coronavirus pandemic, that's certainly going to impact school districts across the nation. And so we need to be very mindful of the financial and economic impact that's currently occurring and will continue to occur, as well as the impact that this potentially could have with regards to future enrollment. So we'll be working back with Decision Insight and through multiple meetings to not only have them go back and look at historical trends, if you go back to 2008 and potentially subsequent before that, when there were challenges across Pennsylvania or the nation, what impact did that have on enrollment in schools? So we can begin to get some better modeling, but we need to be monitoring our own current enrollment as well. And we provide that information to Decision Insight, and we'll be providing a next round of modeling for them based on our numbers with our May 1st numbers. So we need more time with Decision Insight, really refining attendance areas and reconfiguration, and really refining the impact of the options for our buildings. So that we're looking at from the spring to fall, as well as additional work just to finalize the feasibility study. We've received updated facility condition index documents, and that basically is a document for each building that outlines the potential work and when the engineers believe that work should be accomplished. And then begin to develop a timeline, a strategic timeline for us as a district to begin tackling the work that needs to be accomplished in the school district. We'll continue those conversations. CRA is Crabtree Rorbon Associates, and RBC and PFM are the district's financial advisors, because no matter what we do to address these, we need to have and be mindful of the financial impact to the district, because one of those guiding principles was to ensure financial stability for the school district. And then again, trying to, if at all possible, narrow down our options based on continued conversation and feedback. If we can do that from an enrollment standpoint, potentially looking at the buildings and what we need to do, we see that between the spring and fall of 2020. But most importantly, we'll be continuing to come to the community through our board meetings, community meetings, whether it's done virtually like this or face-to-face, whether it's in our buildings. But we'll be sharing the information and bringing you the information that we are sharing with our school board, as well as soliciting feedback based on the options and what we're looking at. Recognizing that this is subject to change based on everything that's going on and where ultimately things will end up. But what we would initially be looking at is the fall of 2020 to January 2029, potentially looking for board approval on final recommendations. I imagine at this point that will most likely be delayed, but as we are working through this, we can't stop working on this. We need to keep moving forward and monitoring the enrollment and really working out a plan to ensure that our buildings continue to get the maintenance they need. Again, you see continued communication with our Hempfield community. That's certainly critical for all of this throughout the entire process. Again, as we move forward from January 2021 to fall 2021, if we were to have realignment moves at that point, recognizing that it is subject to change, we would look to implement transition opportunities for any impacted student and their families. Continuing through the planning, monitoring enrollment, and again, you see communicating with our Hempfield community. As we look then from a year out there, September 21 to 2022, continuing with Decision Insight to get recommended residential impacts, as well as ensuring that we're monitoring the enrollment and really finalizing everything connected to the reconfiguration. Initially, our thoughts were that if there was any type of realignment, it potentially would go into effect for the 21-22 school year. Again, recognizing this is all subject to change. But we continue refining over this course of the September 21 to 2022, refining the projects, the maintenance list for the buildings, and really working to make sure from a financial standpoint that the district is still in good financial health. So I recognize that was a lot of information, but I did want to have an opportunity for anyone with regards to questions on the enrollment and feasibility side. Again, this presentation in its entirety will be posted online tomorrow under the school board section if you go to enrollment and attendance area. And at this point, I'll bring Mrs. Zimmerman back in because I believe she was able to be seeing the questions. And if we have any questions, we do have time. We said this would go to 8 o'clock. So I'm happy to take any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them at this time.
The one question that's there right now, and it's a little bit lengthy, so just hang with me, but it's from a statistical standpoint. So roughly 30% of households in the district have children in school, which means that 70% do not. So if you look at the dwellings in the next several years, how does Decision Insight determine how many children will be coming into the district from that perspective?
That is a great question. And what I will do, I don't want to even attempt to explain that, but I do have information from Decision Insight that we will include we'll post that question when we post this information. I can certainly get it. I just don't have it right here with me. So they provided all of that to us in terms of how they look at that information. Mr. Graham, I know you've been part of some of those conversations. Is there anything you'd like to share with regards to that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things to keep in mind is that Decision Insight looks at not just the fact that a house is being built, but what kind of house is being built and what type of neighborhood it's being built in, the population density, whether it's, a single family dwelling, a townhouse, an apartment, and then looks at, what historically we've seen in terms of the numbers from that particular type of dwelling, that particular area. So while you are 100% correct in that, overall it might be 30%, but for that particular development that's going in, the percentage may be a whole lot higher. And so that's why you're potentially going to see higher numbers of students coming out of some of those areas, particularly in West Hempfield for what's been approved in the developments.
I was able to pull up here while you were talking there. This is the document that I hope that I had that I would be able to give to Mrs. Zimmerman here. But as they look at that within the dwellings, what they do then, basically they determine the number of students that come out. So this is a pretty in-depth document that we will make sure we pull that information out and be able to provide it. So you can see the student generation rate assumptions, all of that is here. And then what they use to determine based on, again, as Mr. Graham shared, the type of dwelling, as well as how they work through that. And if this does not provide the information that our community member is looking for, we can certainly reach out to Decision Insight and get more detailed information from them.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A.
I actually have a follow-up to that if I could. The other things Decision Insight is going to look at is the age of the population within the community. We've all lived and seen neighborhoods where we have young children in, they grow up, they move off, and then you start to see that neighborhood change over in age population, that the people who are retiring, they're downsizing, they're moving away, younger families move in. So that's another factor that Decision Insight is going to look at, is the age population of the current residents, and then have a statistical model to determine algorithm for movement of that age group. And we'd like to have all our people stay here as long as they want to, but the reality of it is, as people have their kids move out of the house, some people want to downsize into a smaller unit, maybe one floor, whatever it happens to be. But that's something that I know Decision Insight, when I've worked with them before, have also factored into.
Thank you both. Okay.
Yeah,
well,
nothing else came in? No?
If that was the question there, again, we will get that information, post it with this presentation. Again, it is being recorded. We do want to thank everybody for joining us again tonight. If you were with us last night for our school board meeting and back again, we're just here for the first time. Thank you for taking time out to hear the information. Again, please go to our district website under the school board, enrollment, and attendance area realignment site. That'll get you to all the information. And again, we'll provide this video as well as the PowerPoint and any additional presentations as we move forward. And look out for any additional updates, any additional meetings, whether they're virtual or face-to-face. And we do, again, thank you for your time. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have a great rest of your evening. Take care.